Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming, and very soon we're going to be jumping back into the Lords of Fallen once more, this time with a new dev team and a remade version of what was a pretty cool universe originally launching in 2014. The game did have some serious issues though. Despite it being a fun early Souls-like, it was very weighed down, ultra slow. It's like you're moving around in tar. You know, that might have been the first Souls-like that I played. This new version though looks very promising, with lots of interesting, unique mechanics centered around a classic Souls-like experience. With that, of course, will be a tough challenge and a lot to learn. So I've put together this video of main things I think a new player needs to know about, a quick starter guide before we all jump in ourselves. So with that said, let's begin. To start with, I first have to highlight the whole two worlds and realms that we play in thing, because it will come up in the combat at times. We have these two worlds. It's the Axiom world and the Umbral world. Basically, we're playing two versions of the same location, living and dead. We play mostly in Axiom, the living world, and probably want to stay there most of the time, because to go to the dead Umbral world, you have to die. You might actually intentionally do that, but initially this means you have a second chance at life if you were to die by surviving the Umbral world and escaping it back to the living one. While you are in the Umbral world though, there's a kind of meter that builds up the longer you're in there that makes things harder and harder, so you do want to escape. The longer you're in there, the more it builds, and apparently the more enemies you kill, the more it fills too. So it might even be a better idea to avoid combat and rush to an escape. But there's this awesome overlap of both worlds through your Umbral lamp. It lets you see into the Umbral world just in front of you by holding up the lamp. It reveals paths and secrets, new ways to get around the terrain, potentially solving the situation you're in by seeing a route through the other world. Something as simple as there being, say, a fence that exists in the living world, but in the dead world it's just not there. So by holding up your lamp, you could pass through that wall. As I mentioned though, this mechanic does breach into the Umbral world while you're still in the living one, which does mean you might have a combat encounter as you bump into an Umbral world enemy. In short though, the solution to your situation could be found in the other world you're currently not in. But now let's talk about the combat, the big thing, the most important thing to get right in a Souls-like. Truly, in my opinion, this is a standard Souls-like experience with core mechanics pulled straight from Souls, but well done with, say, hit weight and the satisfying timings you should expect. Usually, a good Souls-like has a good strong core combat feel, largely inspired, let's say, from the original Souls games, but then they add a few of their own unique mechanics. Compared to the original Lords of the Fallen, this game feels a lot less weighted down to that silly degree, and we have the classic combat mechanics of dodging and blocking and parrying and so on. And you'll fight with your weapon or weapons, using light and heavy combos, maybe charging a heavy attack here or there, using ranged attacks, magic, consumables, buffs, all of the standard stuff you find in a Souls-like. One of the more interesting mechanics here is their take on the rally system, which we also saw in the recent Lies of P. If you play Bloodborne, you should know this one. You take damage, but you have the ability to restore health by attacking. In this case though, we build up a grey or white bar over your health bar as you're blocking damage. They call it withered health. This bar, when fully filled, will completely kill you. So to regain health and prevent that, you need to deal damage. But you'll also want to avoid taking any true damage during this though, because all that withered regainable health is gone if you take a direct hit. I think the mechanic helps prevent overly relying on your shield to mitigate all damage, but it also encourages block trading, which is neat. There's also their own posture system inspired from Sekiro. Build up posture damage to stagger them, then break it with a punish and a special attack. We do that by forcing them to low posture through various sources of damage, and then stagger them with a charged heavy attack, or a parry, or even a kick. Critical attacks are called Grievous Strikes in this game, and we just use a light attack on a staggered enemy to basically perform one. Other standard combat mechanics are things like plunge attacks from the air, so while you're falling, you just use a light or heavy attack. But there are more unique stuff like soul flaying. Using your lamp, you can rip out the soul of an enemy in a chosen direction. In some cases, it will cause them to fall towards it, which leaves them nice and vulnerable for a short period, which is always going to be good. But if you can move them around, you might move them off a ledge, which can be fun. There's a lot of potential with this mechanic beyond just using it to do a big hit, basically. But importantly, you need to know that you want to soul flay main bosses you defeated, because if you don't, you won't get the special weapons and spells and items associated to that boss. So it's actually really important that once you defeat a big bad, you soul flay it to claim the rewards. Lastly, there's also the whole two worlds at once thing coming into combat at times. There's unique enemies where they kind of exist in both realms. To actually damage and fight them, you need to use your lamp to expose what's helping them in the other world. Maybe you reveal a light in the dead world that's kind of buffing them, preventing them from taking damage in the living world. So mid-combat, you use the lamp to expose that, clear it, and then finally deal damage to this special enemy. When it comes to core combat stuff, it's time for us to talk about magic or element types. We have three in this game: Radiance, Inferno, and Umbral. Radiant damage is basically holy, where Umbral is more like the other end, the darkness style stuff, and Inferno is naturally fire. To use these, you will need a catalyst of some sort to, power the spells, like in mainline Souls. To power these up though, there is different rules. The character attributes that you level as a main stat will influence the power of these, right, as you should expect. Level your Radiance or Inferno to power those up, but you actually need a mix of those stats to power Umbral magic, which doesn't have its own unique stat. Inferno magic feels very explosive, focused more on offensive damage spells, burning an enemy with damage over time, big AoE potential. There's even actually summons like the fire-based wolves. On the other hand, Radiant spells are more stereotypically tied to buffing and healing, but there are still lots of different offensive options like light channel beams or lightning bolts and so on. Compared to the two accessible magic types of Radiant and Inferno, Umbral is a lot more slower to cast and slower to move, but has strong potential in exchange. We've seen examples of weapon buffs, these timed bombs, and cleaving arcs from long range from the various early footage. Apparently, if you see a spell from an enemy, there's not only a high chance you can actually use that, but you can even kill the enemy to try to claim that. To balance things out, there's very important resistances you'll face though, enemies that will be vulnerable to certain types, sure, but also very resistant to another. For example, the early game does feature a lot of enemies that are resistant to Inferno fire damage, so if that's your build, it might be an issue. There's going to be times where your Inferno fire focus is going to be awesome. There's also going to be times where if you're fully relying on it, it'll be a real issue, just like the other two main elements. With those main aspects of combat explained, let's now cover the starting class options and what might be the best picks for you now we know how things work. Overall, there are 10 starting classes, though one requires the deluxe edition or to have specifically be a certain ending before it becomes playable. The class is basically the poster boy for all of the media, the Dark Crusader. Personally, I think this was a really cool idea if you had an unlockable class by beating the game or doing something specific in-game. But because there's a pay to unlock it option, I actually really don't like it. But it's not like that matters. Either way, if you do have access to the Dark Crusader, you'll find it a strength-based melee fighter that uses radiant magic initially, using heavy armor, a great sword, and comes with a catalyst, of course, to cast the spells. Compared to that might be the Hallowed Knight, which instead of focusing on a heavy two-handed sword, you have a sword and shield. Much more quality and balanced focused compared to the Strength Crusader, which also means you'll consider more items overall and be a lot more well-rounded. Alternative picks for quality style builds would be the Partisan and the Mornstead Infantry, who both have no points towards either magic stat compared to the Knight. The Partisan between the two has a closer balance of stats and comes with a crossbow compared to the longer weapon and more sturdy shield of the Infantry. If you're thinking about going pure strength and don't really want to worry about magic, the Udaranger Warwolf is probably the clear pick aside from the Crusader. Its starting stat focuses on strength, vitality, and endurance, basically the pure strength class to pick. Apparently later there's possible war cries to get, which may involve magic stats for the buffs associated, but you would imagine those would have lower requirements. On the other end of main melee combat, you've got the agility focused side of things. Our two picks are the Blackfeather Ranger and Exiled Stalker. Two sides of that coin, in the Ranger using a bow while the Stalker uses dual daggers. Now based on what I've seen, the Stalker has some range issues because tiny range daggers and a lack of posture damage, which is certainly going to be an issue. Potentially the power of poisons and other buffs and fast attacks will be something really deadly, but I think between the two, the Ranger is going to be the easier pick of the two for a new player. You start with a more balanced axe and shield for survivability. It's much less punishing to actually have a shield to rely on than just daggers and dodging. Then you've got the really powerful and useful bow for ranged attacks, which if you headshot, you deal even more damage, and you still can deal poison damage from range with poison arrows. Lastly, you also have your more spellcaster focused options in the Orion Preacher and Pyric Cultist. In short, the Preacher leans on radiant spells, while the Cultist leans on Inferno spells. If you want to focus on casting as your main damage source, these two will be your picks, and it'll be the type of casting you want to main that decides which one you go for. One more class to mention, the Condemned, is essentially a challenge mode start that you can do if you want. You start with all stats at level 9 and next to no protection from your clothing and your fists. A classic pick for those who like an extra challenge to start. You might see speedrunners use this, we'll see. But which should you pick? I'd say if you're looking for a strength focused build, it's clearly Warwolf or the Crusader if you want to lean a little bit on magic too. It'll be between the Stalker and Ranger for agility, but as I said, I think Ranger will be the safer, easier pick, but that's not to say the Stalker doesn't have high potential. It's down to your preference for magic focused builds if you're going to play Preacher for Radiant or the Cultist for Inferno. Lastly, for quality, any of the three picks will be good in Partisan, Infantry, and the Hallowed Knight. Personally, I'd suggest the Knight though, since it comes with heavy armor and radiant damage potential, which should be quite helpful early on. Hopefully that overview helps you make your choice. But yeah, there you have it. Those are the main things I felt that a new player would really need to know without overwhelming you, but important details to understand. If you have any extra details or tips to help new players that you've learned from watching stuff, maybe drop it in the comments and you might help someone. For now though, we will see you at launch. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.